A new coalition is focused on keeping the Scaffold law in place as opposition to it grows. The Scaffold law regulates construction site safety and sets the standards for who is responsible when an accident occurs. Supporters say it is needed to protect construction workers who do a very dangerous job. Joining me from New York City tonight to explain more is Josie Duffy of the Center for Popular Democracy. Thank you so much for your time. It's good to see you.
Thank you so much for having me, Liz.
Okay, so let's start with this. There's a new coalition, and the mere fact that there was a coalition formed indicates to me that you feel like this issue is worth fighting back against. In other words, we just had Jacques de Graaf and Mike Elmendorf here from the Associated Contractors, and they're making a big push. So this issue is clearly heating up if you guys are meeting that push with a push of your own.
Well, I would say that the coalition is mostly focused on sort of setting the record straight. You know, what we're hearing when we talk to people about this law, when we talk to citizens about this law, is just misinformation after misinformation. So our real goal here is to just make it clear what this law does, what this law has done in the past, and why it's important. And really remind people that construction workers have an incredibly dangerous job. What they do day to day is incredibly dangerous. It's often life-threatening, and protecting them is important. It's an important legal protection.
It's also notable to me that, and I read the release in which you guys announced this new coalition, and you make the point in particular that workers of color, that would be Latinos and African Americans, have a higher incidence, because it's usually them who are doing a lot of this work, of getting injured on the job. On the flip side, when I talk to folks like the Reverend de Graaf and Mr. Elmendorf, they say, well, this is actually a civil rights issue on our end too, because MWBE entities, which would be you know, black and women-owned businesses, can't get insurance because of this law. It causes premiums to be too high.
So I would say a couple of things in response to that. First of all, it is very true that minority and immigrant construction workers have a higher risk of a higher rate of injury on construction sites. In New York City, construction injuries, minority and immigrants accounted for 74% of construction injuries last year, 74%. So they really are a significant percentage of the people who are suffering when construction sites aren't safe enough. And you know, this conversation about insurance, I'm glad that you brought it up, because it's sort of based on a premise that has no actuarial evidence to prove it yet. So this idea that liability insurance is going up because of workers' comp, there's actually no evidence to show that. And in fact, liability insurance, the rates are rising all across the country. So across the nation, insurance companies are charging more and more for liability insurance, and we actually don't really know why that is yet. We don't know why that is because insurance companies aren't willing to open their books, and there's a transparency issue. So this idea that you know, we obviously sympathize and understand that running a small business is difficult, and that, you know, it's the costs and the benefits and the costs are very neck and neck, and that that these things matter to people who own small businesses. But this idea that they're paying more in insurance because of the scaffolding law is just completely without evidence.
Okay.
I mean, really completely without evidence.
Okay, so I know that there is legislation pending that would require the books to be opened and would put the information on the table. So if in fact we were to determine that there is in fact evidence that the Scaffold law is doing what the construction folks say it is, and is the culprit that causes these costs to go up, then would your side be willing to say, okay, let's talk about some kind of agreement that we can make here? Because clearly, if you can't have enough businesses that are doing jobs because they can't be insured, then you can't have them hiring workers, and that's a problem on both sides.
Yes, I mean, I would say that I'm confident that that is not that would not be the result. But let's say that it was. There are a couple of things to think about. The first is that what this law is basically saying is that employers have to follow the law. So all it is saying is that you have to put into action the protections that are already under the state law. So this idea of, you know, there being some very new high standard of what construction companies have to do. It's just not true. These are the rules that would be under, I'm sorry, these are the regulations that would be under state law regardless, right? So there's that to consider. I mean, the other thing I think to consider is that we're sort of talking about two different issues. I mean, they're obviously related, but one is insurance and whether or not we need insurance reform and whether or not we need to have that conversation, which, you know, I'm completely willing to have and admit that that's a conversation that may need to be had. And the other is worker safety. So this law protects workers. This law protects people who are really completing day in and day out some of the toughest jobs and the most dangerous jobs in our workforce, and they deserve to be protected. So I'm not quite convinced that the liability insurance issue is so directly related, should be so directly related to scaffolding that this law should have to change to fix insurance. I think that those are sort of two different things that we have to address.
Is it though just the scaffold law that is standing between, you know, workers and complete disregard for their safety? I mean, as you know, there is requirements in state law and federal law for making provisions regarding safety. I mean, what scaffold law applies to is after you're injured and what kind of settlement you can get in terms of going to court.
Well, right. I mean, it requires, exactly. So, I mean, it sort of addresses both. It addresses both the court process and you're right, the post-injury process. But I wouldn't say, obviously, that, I wouldn't imply that because of the scaffold law, otherwise all employers would be running wild, you know, no protections in place whatsoever. But the reality is that this law has been shown time and time again to have actually resulted in lesser injuries and lesser incidents. And what it does is it provides an incentive. It provides an incentive for construction companies. It provides an incentive for contractors to ensure that they are creating and instituting and training their workers to make sure that they're you know, they have the protections they need, they're safe, and that they're properly trained. And you know, to me, that there's just no way that isn't making it safer for workers. You know, when we talk about what would happen if there were no scaffold law, where there would be less incentive for employers to take care of their workers. So
the list of members of your coalition, as I'm looking at it here, includes a lot of so-called progressive organizations and labor organizations. The Working Families Party, for example, the New York Hotel Trades Council, SEIU 32BJ, I'm just naming a few. Not located anywhere on this is the trial lawyers, which, if you talk to folks who are proponents of changing scaffold, they say that it's the trial lawyers who are in fact the biggest obstacle, and also labor, obviously, and you're laying out the concerns of labor. But what about this idea that, you know, to keep scaffold in place is a bonanza for the sorts of people who handled these cases?
What I would say in response to that question is that the people that we're working with in our coalition and the people that I'm working with day to day at my job are people who are fighting for workers. They're fighting for workers' safety. So that is the point. You know, I've heard that a couple of times over the past couple of days about trial lawyers and maybe this is just to get more people in court. To me, it's pretty clearly to keep people safe. It's pretty clearly to make sure that people who are working in construction, who are usually minorities, they often are lower income, they often are immigrants, they don't have a lot of either the monetary protections that, you know, other people have, or in other jobs there are different levels of sort of protecting your workers that construction workers wouldn't have without this scaffold law. So I think that that's sort of what I would say is that's a red herring, and it's my experience has been completely a coalition of people who are dedicated to workers' rights and to making sure that workers are protected on construction sites. I mean, to me, it's pretty straightforward.
We only have about 7 weeks or so left in the session. It seems like this could be one of those late-breaking issues, although we talked about it a lot at the beginning of the session, and I think that there were a number of people on the pro-changing side that had hoped that this ended up in the budget, and the fact that it did not is really, I think, sort of a boon to folks like you who are trying to prevent, you know, some kind of changing from happening. So how likely is it, do you believe, that we're going to have this debate and see it pop sometime during the session? I'm
hopeful. I'm not prepared to speculate. But what I would say is that another great thing about our coalition, and another great thing about us all coming together, is that there are other things we can do. So, you know, education is a huge thing. We have been just seeing some really egregious misconceptions as we've been, you know, talking to people and advocating for worker protection. So being able to sort of educate people, being able to fight against misconceptions, and being able to sort of bring more people and groups into our coalition is also our goal. So I'm not going to speculate on what's going to happen by the end of the session, but I'm hopeful.
That's probably wise, this being Albany, because, you know, it's really difficult to predict what's going to happen here.
Right, right.
So I thank you very much. It is an issue that we have been watching for actually a couple of years now, and we shall see. I thank you, Josie Duffy, for your time.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.